Hey everybody, it's me, Root Beer, and today we're here with Latent Engagement Bait, also minor misspelling, so I automatically lose this argument. But I asked everyone on Twitter, what's a deck that you just don't believe in? So, plenty of people out there have their pet deck that they're willing to cope on regardless of circumstance, but today I want to know the opposite. What is a deck that, regardless of what people say, or even if it gets top cuts, that you are just convinced is actually bad? So I'm gonna begin with Michu. So this is a deck that I really wanted to like. She has a very unique look among like lyrical decks, and also I pulled an LSR out of a sneak peek for set 3, but like it just never clicked for me. Like you would think that this deck was positioned really well, especially during the meta where it came out, because it's got 4 attacks, 2 of them are Vanguard attacks. You have pretty decent draw power thanks to like the cannonballs, and the cannonballs also give you pretty good offensive power because they give 10k to the 3 units. So you have like pretty good numbers, 4 attacks, a restanding Vanguard, but it just like never actually came together into any kind of meta relevance. And every now and then I'd see a tier list where people insist that like Michu was playable actually, and it just like never put up the results. So Hao says Zorga here, and yes, if I didn't put Michu as my example, like Zorga would definitely be my second answer. Like Zorga has the tops to be considered like a competent deck. So I will go to bat a little bit for it. Like I think the deck is fine, but I think the Zorga defenders really wanted to be in the same kind of conversation that decks like Chronojet or Gondiva or now like Shiranui were during their periods of relevance. And I think Zorga just never quite reached that level. I think like a good Zorga player can do a lot of things with the deck. There's a lot of like little decisions both in like deck building and how you manage like bouncing with Shadow Cloak and the kinds of orders that you alchemagic with, but like on the whole, I think like having too many orders means the deck is a little bricky. You're playing a lot of cards that like don't have shield value, so you can just lose in very frustrating ways. And overall, like Zorga is just the eternal tier 2. Youthberk, a pretty good example. So, Zex here is talking about Full Blast specifically because this card really is just terrible. Like, Bushiroad tried its hardest to prop this deck up by adding, like, 2 custom support cards that are, like, expressly designed so that this card will resolve. But, like, that means your deck building is really, like, closed off because okay, you have to play the other Revol forms to make this work. You have to play the cards that search your Revol forms because this has to resolve. And then, of course, you still have to find, like, this card itself. So there's just so many ways that it can just brick randomly. Like, you don't have as much room for customizations because so much space is just, like, must play cards to make this card work. And overall, it's just not good. I will say, like, this made me think about Youthberk as a whole, and I do find it a little bit amusing that, like, I think Full Blast actually follows a pretty similar trajectory that Tempest did in the meta. Like, I'm starting to think, with the benefit of hindsight, that actually Youthberk as a whole might just be an answer to this question, because, like, the original Tempest came out alongside a couple of other like top meta decks. So like Eva and Dote were pretty relevant at this point. Full Blast came out in pretty similar circumstances alongside like Grejeweled and Leonorn. And then, a lyrical set comes out that kinda adds some other things into contention. Lutetia for Tempest and Labrador for Full Blast that like doesn't really push it out of the meta, just exists alongside it. And then both times a stride deck comes out that just like melts everybody's brains. So like Chronojet the first time around, and now like Shiranui just like completely overshadow everything else. So like I do find that a little bit amusing. Yeah, Sayana is like an interesting card. Like the defensive ability is cool, but it doesn't have a way to actually like win the game. So a lot of people say like Resile in this thread. I'm not sure I fully agree. Like this post in particular is talking about how like you loop the dog a lot, and I think one of the other quote tweets I have about Resile is talking about how it's like carried by the Keter pile, and it's like yeah, sort of, but Resile is also a very like rearguard centric deck. He's a toolbox that grabs from the drop zone, so like he's a very good base for the Keter pile. Like I will agree that it is actually just like the worst Luard, but like I do think Reziel being able to grab from the drop zone has a lot of advantages that work with the Keter pile. Like it means you can cycle the Sergawons very easily. Like retire is not completely game ending. Like you can kind of bounce back from it in some regards. Like Reziel is the kind of card that is only as good as its rear guards, and it has very good rear guards, so I don't fully agree. And also, like the divine skill, I think gives you a lot of freedom, which means like if you draw or search out with Saragalon a lot of your crit triggers early, like you can use them for their defensive value and then shuffle them back into the deck. So that gives you a little more flexibility to deal with like bad RNG. Blangdmire, good answer. So Blangdmire is a deck that, like, when it released with, and we all saw the divine skill, I think people's brains broke a little bit just because, like, we haven't had to deal with that kind of thing up until this point. Like, a turn wide guard restrict that stops you from calling sentinels, like deleting the vanguard, as well as like deleting abilities that you as the player get is like not something we've had to interact with that much for D era, and D is also missing a lot of the like defensive tools that I think made guard restrict more bearable in older formats. So like we don't have G guards, for example, and blitz orders can only do so much when most decks only play the one. Uh, can only play the one per turn is what I want to say. So, like, I don't think Blangdmire is bad necessarily, but yes, the divine skill is definitely overhyped. Also, Blangdmire can just like brick in really weird and annoying ways. Like the ride deck, because it's like, okay, you check top three, grab all the normal units, and shuffle back any triggers. It's like, okay, if you see too many triggers, then you don't soul charge early, and that might put you in a position where you can't resolve Blankmire's first skill all the way. It also means like you could lose out on early advantage because you're not drawing. Like Blankmire has problems. I don't think it's bad necessarily, but definitely overhyped. Uh, Leohan, a good example, like came out in that weird middle ground between like the Stride decks and like the new season. So, like I think it had a lot of initial hype because it was looking like very similar to Youthberk. It gets like 4 or 5 drive checks. I don't really remember off the top of my head, to be perfectly honest. And in Japan, at least, it did have like a couple of tops initially, but yeah, it just like dropped off the face of the earth once Divine Z came out and people realized, like, wait a minute, there are actually like other interesting decks that we can cope on now. Okay, does anyone actually think that Graham Grace is good? I remember trying to like play this against the final boss in Deer Days, and boy, was that not a good time. Admittedly, like this was before the stand-up deck set came out, so I had to cope on a lot of really bad generic Keter cards. But like, yeah, was Graham Grace ever a deck that anyone actually thought was good? Messiah, very good answer. So Messiah has this like weird thing where like being Link Joker and revolving around like lock as a mechanic means that it can't take advantage of generic tools in the same way that all of the other stride decks can. But also, like being in Grant Gate specifically, where everything revolves around set orders, it's like there's not a lot of crossover between these two archetypes, which means you really are just jamming like mostly the stride deck plus any generic soul charger you can find for the draw skill. So I had a couple of responses talking about like set one lyrical archetype. So we have like Felty Rosa and Laurel Nerl, which I've definitely coped on Laurel Nerl at one point. But I think like in general, the set one archetypes, aside from Willista, really like fell off after the first wave. Like, Laurel Narrow was pretty decent early on just because we didn't have a lot of guard restricts to deal with at that time, but then, as time went on, the game got faster, like, she couldn't really keep up, and I think the same thing happened with, like, Clarissa, which was also pretty good when Lyrical first came out and then fell off really quickly. Like, Alestiel was never quite good. It seemed like the dress up could be something and then, like, wasn't. Another person put Felty Rosa in the thread, and again, like, the dress up seemed like it could have been, like, pretty good and had some, like, early tops in Japan similar to Lilhan, but, like, just never actually went anywhere, and I feel like nowadays there's so many lyrical archetypes, and these cards are at least a little bit entrenched in what they're currently doing that I'm not sure Bushiroad can fix them anymore without just introducing, like, a third form. Okay, a lot of the replies in here say, like, Varga. So, this one is like, no filter, no CB less pressure. This one is talking about how the deck, like, exists to win and lose by drive checks, and I'm not sure I completely agree with this sentiment. Like, I've played against a decent number of Vargas at my local. We have a few players that jam the deck, and, like, I think it does have all of the tools to be competent regardless of drive checks, because it's like, you still have a pretty good resource loop, like the grade 2 from the ride line that retires itself to draw, and then the other grade 2 that can, like, when something is retired, you bounce it to the hand and revives itself when retired. Like, that produces a pretty good, like, resource loop for you where you draw a card off the ride line and then bounce it back to hand so you can do it again next turn. The numbers are pretty decent. Varga gets 10k on himself. A lot of your other units also gain power, and you play a lot of, like, 10, 13k boosters that, like, make your numbers good. So, like, the Revival grade 2 also gets 5k off of that ability, and 10 from the Revival skill when it brings itself back from the drop zone. So, like, you have pretty good numbers there, especially if you Persona Ride, like, the numbers get really good. That means she's hitting for, like, 30 on her own, so you could be, like, attack plus a boost for, like, 30, 33, gets retired by Varga, you bring it back, it's still 30. Like, the front row retire can be really annoying if you're playing a deck that doesn't deal with it. Like, I don't know that I agree that Varga is bad outside of, like, crit sacking. I think it has all of the tools to be a good deck. It has a solid resource loop, good numbers, like, good amount of attacks. It really just needs, like, countercharging. Alright, yeah, Bastion is a pretty good example of this. I think, like, set 1 Bastion was good, but it was also existing in a low power environment where the game hadn't been figured out yet, right? Like, we were at the start of a new format. I do think Apex Bastion is, like, a card that I never got behind. Like, I really didn't like it when it first came out. Also, it was expensive, so I didn't bother upgrading the deck. And then playing it in the context of, like, Bastion Accord, I feel like I only ever had Apex to discard for the drive check ability. Like, I never wanted to actually ride Apex Bastion for any reason. And, like, Bastion Accord itself is a really cool card. Like, I really like this card. I think it missed its point of relevance in EN because we didn't get the owl early enough. And then, after that, they just haven't really supported the deck since then, so of course it's gonna drop out of relevance. Very unfortunate. I want this deck to be good because I like Bastion Accord, but it doesn't really have enough tools right now. And that's gonna be it for this video. There were a lot of good responses in this thread, a lot of posts that I agree with, a couple that I didn't, and a couple people just posting cards that no one ever thought was good. And also, I think Changu is probably trying to figure out where I live, so if we don't make another one of these, you know why. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.